Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Namaste, hello everyone. Welcome to the NPTEL course, Role of Craft and Technology in Interior Architecture. Today we are going to talk about Module 21, where we will discuss Craft and Technology in Interior Architecture, decoding systems within it. So when we talk about systems and when we talk about architecture, just like a language has a structure to it and an embedded system, the same way the build form, the interior architecture and the craft, they also have a lot of systems that help us understand how to decode the build form, how to decode the craft expression and how to understand the process of making. So let us try to understand here. So I would like to begin with Vitruvius. So Vitruvius in his book 4 chapter 1 says, when the Dorians wanted to add columns to their temples, they didn't know how to establish a relation between the parts and the whole. Nor could they determine a dimension which could give a solid support, the weight of graceful appearance. Therefore, what they did as a solution was, they chose the footprint of a male person and set it in relation to the person's height. So, the reference for drawing the proportions of the columns was the male human body. As they discovered that foot length was equivalent to the sixth of the man's height, they transferred this ratio to their columns. Each of them was 6 times higher than the diameter of the column shaft. So again, this is a system in place when there was no idea of dimensions or a proportion system. How the Dorians actually took reference of the human male body and then they tried to come up with a proportion system where there was this ratio achieved between the footprint of the male and the height, and that's what they translated in the columns when we see it in the different buildings. So here if we see, the footprint of human body was taken as a reference to understand the proportions of column. So this is a Dorian one and this is a Corinthian. Here we see the curves and the decoration, and this is fairly simple. So a system was derived where the footprint and the height, a ratio was set between it and then it was translated on the columns. And this is also to understand that how human body and the anthropometric dimensions are very stable and how nature has actually provided us with a reference that could be translated to various interior architecture products and how we try to understand the geometry and the principles of making which lie underneath it. There are several other examples that we see where the human body is taken as a reference and then a proportion system is evolved out of it and then translated to interior architecture. And here all these references, they have been documented and we see it in literature through books in history. For example, here if we see this building, the temple at Sagasta, it's a 5th century BC building. Here we see how there is this system of Pythagorean triangles that helps achieve the proportions, and this is how the geometry is achieved and then it is translated into the making of this interior architecture. We see it here. So this entire example over here, again there is a system of working which is involved. Now systems could be studied at varied levels, there could be a system of classification, there could be a system of organization, collection. We could talk about a system of working where we understand the hierarchy of the involved stakeholders. There could also be a system that helps us understand how to establish an interrelationship between the craft and the build form. So systems could be understood at varied levels in varied capacities. This is another example, very famous temple of Athena, and again we see in the plan as well as in the elevation there is this system of Pythagorean triangles The triangles that have been incorporated here to understand the proportion, to understand the relation between different components and to achieve a certain proportion system. Here if we see another temple, we see a system of grid which is being used here. So there is a grid which is followed and there is a system that is involved in the making of it. So again a system of proportions. Then there was also an emergence of varied catalogues, the building trade catalogues, which is again a system of collection, a system of curating, a system of organizing different elements. So space making elements, landscaping elements, furniture elements. So these were the catalogues that came up and they proved to be a sort of a system of organization and collection, also at times classification. So these were referred and then a lot of these references were integrated and incorporated in the different interior architecture, furniture elements, landscape elements, and then this is how the repository was created and the knowledge was transferred and referred later. Here if we see, this is a page from Langley's New Principles of Gardening. So when we are talking about city planning and landscaping, lot of principles of gardening and lot of experimentation with serpentine lines and mazes, they were seen in the city planning or the interior architecture, landscaping, and again this is also a system, how the principles of gardening are translated in interior architecture. This is a very interesting slide that we see here. So what is happening is that one tries to apply the learning from botanical sciences into interior architecture. So if we see the botanical sciences and if we see the nature, the plants which are available in nature, there is a sort of a system of classifying the plants also. So the botanical sciences does give those kinds of references where we try to group a certain kind of plant family and then there are another groups. And then the understanding and learning from this was applied here in interior architecture where certain kind of grouping and classification was made and then certain kind of references were drawn from nature and then the kind of interior architecture was also understood in terms of form and articulation and the classification that was done. So this is also a system in place which helps us understand, decode interior architecture, the craft integrated within it, also understanding the principles of making, the system that allows the coming together of different components and forming this piece of interior architecture. Continuing with the principles of gardening, here also we see lot of principles of gardening and botanical sciences and how these were applied also at the city planning level here. And there were a lot of books and catalogues that came up that described this kind of interrelationship and referencing, drawing from nature to interior architecture. Even in simple things like this is a pedestrian sideway in New York. Here also what we see is a pattern. But this pattern that we see over here is formed by the repetition and joining of these hexagonal units. Now there is a system in place with which this structure evolves and this pattern is seen over here. So and we find these kinds of references in a lot of places. So here that what we see is a scheme of infinite repeat which gives this kind of a pattern which could go on a flooring or a wall surface or wherever. So there is always a system in place and if we try to understand that system, we will be surely able to understand the component part and the way these parts or modules are joined to create a larger structure to it, and it always helps us understand the process that goes within. Again, this is a very interesting historical reference where we see this classification and a system that helps us understand varied categories within architecture. So architecture civil and architecture hydraulic. So when there is a mention of hydraulic, there is a discussion about aqueducts and water architecture, and when we talk about civil, there is a mention of structure, design, art and the related categories. So this system again is put in place to help us understand varied categories and at what levels in which capacity a particular kind of interior architecture is taken up and what are the methods involved in it. Talking about India, a lot of us already know about Vastu Vidya and Vastu Shastra and how significant this science has been to understand the system of making and the principles of making embedded within it. So if we talk about Vastu Vidya, it was also a sort of a system of making that helped us understand various laws of nature and the various processes involved, various methods of making. So just briefly describing it, Vastu Vidya is the traditional Indian science of architecture and house buildings. It is the ancient Indian knowledge of architecture. It is as old as the Vedas. So we find the reference of Vastu Vidya even in the Vedas, starting from the Rig Veda, that belong to the period of 1500 to 1000 BC. The inception of traditional Indian architectural theory is evident in its first textual evidence in the Rig Veda. So that also mentions about architecture and the principles of making. We see the mention of protector of the house, and then the rituals associated with architecture are also described in the later Vedas, Sutras, Puranas, Tantras, Vastu Shastra, and the compilations until the 15th century AD. So since we are talking about reference to human body, taking into account nature and our surroundings, trying to understand how the making is achieved, we are talking about proportional systems, we are talking about principles of gardening being applied. It is very apt and apposite that we also discuss about these traditional Indian sciences which have found mention since very old Upanishads and scriptures, and that's how a lot of people have still continued to apply Vastu Vidya, and there are still people who follow these principles, and there is this understanding of the systems that help decode the practice of interior architecture and how it is related to our cosmos and supernatural powers and manifestations of universe. So the date of its inception as a specialized science dealing with architecture is speculated to be much before the advent of the 1st century AD. By then it had fully developed technically. So technically it was taken as a science. So the systems were already technically proven and they have been applied significantly over a very long period of time. A little more discussion on this. So besides such theories, the very essence of dwelling architecture has been even discussed by ancient cultures through religious scriptures and textbooks such as Rig Vedas, that is what we were discussing in the last slide also, which show the importance of the piece of architecture in the life of its inhabitants. So this connection between the inhabitants and the piece of architecture created is what this ancient science actually focused on, and which is what is paramount and should be actually taken into account. So in the Upanishads, which are based on Vedas, 4 essential theories are described as the basic principles of the universe, which should also be applied in the construction of any piece of architecture. Now this is also a sort of a system which acts as a guideline, which talks about the principles of making and which talks about the laws that have been taken into account. So the 4 major ones that were focused were: the laws of nature are the sources of order and harmony in the universe. Every being in nature is animated. All beings are interconnected and originated from a supreme creative energy. So all of these considerations were taken into account, and then a system which had these principles of making embedded in it were constituted, and they were always used as a guideline, and they are still used as a guideline, and a built form generates out of the application of these systems and principles of making. If we see Vastu Vidya, then there are different phases which have been also identified, and these also are a sort of reflection how within different phases there was a different focus or a different area of importance chosen, and then how it developed through a period of time. And that also happens in the build forms, it happens with materials. So there is this gradual transformation and progress, and there are phases of working, there are stages of working, and that we see here also. This is very interestingly mapped up. Also, there is something very interesting when we talk about Vastu Vidya. The text starts with an invocation of Lord Vishwakarma, the divine architect, and then goes on to describe the architectural team. So the team usually consists of 4 experts who are said to have their mythological origin from Brahma. Team that has been described is Sthapati, the master builder or architect, the Sutragrahin, which is the surveyor, the Takshaka, the carpenter, and the Vardhaki, the painting expert. So this is the architectural team, and it consists of these 4 experts, and the divine architect is the one who leads. So although the various texts on Vastu Vidya are similar in their layout of the building norms, the adaptation of the dictates varies according to the region it is applied to. So again, there is a system in place, but it may have regional variations, it may have lot of cultural connotations. So a system could also be modified, altered, and then according to the belief system and the region, religion, it could have certain alterations. Talking about Vastu Purush Mandala, it is also a sort of a system that helps us understand a building in its metaphysical form, and then try to also have associations with the supernatural powers and the energy points. So Vastu Purush Mandala is an indispensable part of Vastu Shastra, and it is the metaphysical plan of a building that incorporates the course of the heavenly bodies and supernatural forces. So if we see over here this square, it has been divided into various zones, and there is a grid which is being followed, and every square has a certain representation. It connotes to a certain supernatural power, it connotes to a heavenly body. And whenever the house or a built form is constructed keeping in mind these principles, it is said that there would be a divine presence, and the house would breathe and live for long. So again, these systems have evolved from the age old traditional knowledge systems. They have belief systems associated to them, and they have also scientifically proven to be effective, and that's how they still continue over such a long span of time. Very interestingly, we see these principles of Vastu Shastra, Vastu Vidya being applied in the planning of city Jaipur, and there are few interesting things here. So it should be noted that the Vastu principles were applicable at all scales in Jaipur, ranging from the city's spatial network to the detailed design of the streetscape, buildings and architecture. So it was not just a particular built form or one particular building, but it was seen in the entire spatial configuration from the street to the buildings. Unlike many historic towns in the world, Jaipur is functioning well in present urban context also. So if it is said that it was done so many years ago and probably it's not relevant today, then it has been already documented and validated and discussed that it is functioning well in the present urban context as well. So these systems in place and the principles of making, which have been existent since a very long time, they are technically and scientifically proven now. Without losing importance, these spatial structures have sustained many cultural, social and economic changes, and this proves the robustness and resilience of these age-old theories and systems. That's the focus here that we are discussing. Even architecture and townscape of key streets was given special importance, such as in the case of Jaipur, to develop a coherent image of the city. So how do we get this coherent image of the city when the system is applied not just at the building level but also from the streetscape to other micro levels? So it's a micro level application to a macro level application, and it gives a cohesiveness and it gives a uniform image of the city, which also turns into its identity later. Also, I would like to discuss very briefly this interesting architectural theory of Mansara, because we are talking about these systems in traditional Indian architecture. So Mansara is a treatise on Vastu Shastra, the science of theory of architecture. Mansara outlines the theory of making, so it also has these systems of making in place. It discusses those, and according to the text encompasses the threefold categories of buildings, conveyances and furniture. It is a voluminous text, the contents of which include principles of architectural composition and systems of proportional measurement. Also technical instructions on the building procedure, such as the selection and examination of site, orientation, collection of materials and so on, as well as prescriptions for rituals associated with construction. So, we already have such treatises, we have so many scriptures which define these systems which have been in place, and they try to help guide us over the period of time, over several ages, to understand the interior architecture, craft expressions and the processes involved in the making. It also contains classifications of buildings, iconographic details of images of various deities and systems of proportional measurement to be employed in their making. So, we have these references, documented references to follow, to take references. What is important is to note, Vastuvidya first found mention in the Rig Veda. Later the expression could be found in the texts like Mansara and Mayamata, and this is Mansara that we were discussing. There is also a sort of relation that is seen while talking about Vastuvidya and then the 10 books on architecture. We see a lot of similar subjects being addressed, the main philosophy and the main systems in place, they being similar, and that kind of relationship has been studied by researchers and the similarity has been drawn by them. So, while Vastu is a science that speaks of the primary elements and the metaphysical Vastu Purusha, 10 books on architecture also talks about how nature, if it has composed the human body so that in its proportions the separate individual elements answer to the total form. So, there is a sort of a reference and there are sort of similarities. Mansara has 70 chapters, out of which 50 deal with architecture. Of the 10 books of Vitruvius, 7 deal with similar subjects. So, these kinds of references and systems we see in India, internationally, a lot of them have been followed till date. The 10 books on architecture are very famous, they have been seen as Bible, and we still follow Vastu. There are some more interrelationships and the kind of analysis which has been done between Vastu and the Vitruvius 10 books on architecture. So, they also talk about architect and systems of measurement. There is Shilpi Lakshana and Manu Prakarna, which we see in the Vastu Vidya, and Vitruvius also deals with principles of architecture and education of an architect. Mansara describes Thapati or the chief architect, and there is a mention of Vedas and Shastras. Vitruvius also says an architect has to be ingenious and apt and well versed in geometry and optics. Mansara has the habitation divided into ground, building, conveyance and bed, and Vitruvius talks of building, dialing and mechanics. Mansara speaks of Bhupariksha, detailing ways of soil examination, and Vitruvius also talks about climatic conditions, elevation, orientation and so forth. So, we see a lot of relationships here. Now, since we are talking about systems in place, there is a very profound presence of mathematics and geometry in Indian architecture. So, the earliest texts on Indian mathematics are the Shulva Sutras, which are compilations of mathematical principles that have developed in India during ancient times. So, we will see some examples and how we will see how the geometric schema and the application of mathematics has a very significant role in Indian interior architecture and craft practices. This is the very famous Brihadeshwar temple, and if we see this point of Vimana and the two extreme points here, there is this creation of an isosceles triangle which is considered to be a very stable geometry. So, there are also standard measures used in construction. They are also in place and we see them mentioned in scriptures. They are derived from the ancient Vastu Shastra, which measure 1 3/8 inch and is used even today. So, again these are systems in place which also give us the formulae for calculation, what is the stable geometry and what is the form that should be achieved. Other units of measure include Hast, Muzam or Kishku, with 24 units equaling to 33 inches. So we also have a system in place which describes about methods of measurement. So like earlier, if we didn't have a measuring tape, how would we measure? So there are methods or the systems of measurement also. How you take reference of your pacing, how you take reference of your hand, and how the dimension is derived. How we understand our body in relation to the other interior architecture or a piece of object, and then the ratio we try to understand, the proportion we try to understand. Similar measurement principles are observed in the ancient structures of Indus Valley civilization some 4000 to 6000 years ago. So we see this significant application of principles of geometry and mathematics in interior architecture. The very famous Taj Mahal, if we see here, it is known to be a very symmetric building. So this building is the best example of symmetry, and the best part was that it was required to measure half the actual building because the building had a mirror symmetry. The equal distance of the windows and doors from one another, the formations of the minarets, the proportions of the domes to the arch. So there is a system of making in place, there is a profound role of geometry, we see symmetry over here. There is also a science if we study about Taj Mahal, how the plinth was taken up and the well foundation, because there is a lot of water there, was constructed, and different geometrical details of the Mughal architecture are seen there. So these are some examples which are timeless, and we still study them to understand the systems which are embedded within the principles of making. Here we see this Amber Fort Jaipur, which is more popularly called as Amer Fort. If we see the crafts over here in the ceiling, the mirror work over here, here also we see the role of geometry, and here also we see mathematics in place. So whether it's the entire built form or the structure, or it's a surface application of a certain building craft, there is a role of geometry, there are the mathematical ways of calculations, and there are systems in place which enable us to create that build form or later decode it in terms of stepwise making or the expressions that were given. So because we are talking about the importance of mathematics, the mathematics and geometric patterns also help in defining the symbolic concepts in construction. So if we see this mosque in Dholka, Gujarat, here also we see a lot of systems, geometry, triangles, and how the entire play of triangles generates a certain geometry over here, and then how the construction is done. So this is a very interesting mosque, its ceiling is also very interesting. Again we see the play of mandala, how the system of mandala has been applied for constructing this build form, where we have this system of grids which is followed, and then the entire process is achieved. So mandala is also a very old system which is being defined in our traditional science of interior architecture, and we see the entire city plan of Jaipur also follows the mandala. There is also a system of creating hierarchy of spaces. So as one enters courtyard, and then how you enter this zone which is the prayer hall, and how for women there is a separate zone. So there is a system also in creating the hierarchy of spaces, there is a system to create the organization of the space, how one moves and circulates, and how one enters to this main worship hall. So that kind of a system is also there which could be analyzed and studied to understand the built form and the interior architecture. If we talk about construction and structure, there is also a system in place how one constructs a particular element. So if we are talking about the space making element dome, this is how it is constructed on squinches, and when we don't have squinches, this is how it is constructed using pendentives. So again there are systems in place which we have the references to follow and understand. Now since we were talking about certain catalogues earlier, this again is a sort of a catalogue which talks about the different kinds of squinches starting from 1236 to 1540, how a particular squinch has evolved or transformed or changed. So this kind of a system in place and the catalogues that have been developed and archived, they also help us understand evolution of a particular element or of a particular build form over a period of time, which also takes into account how the materials have changed, how the technology has changed, how the principles of making have evolved. So those kinds of important data and information are also generated by these systems of collection and archiving and documenting. So there is a system in place there also when we document and archive. Again, talking about few examples. So we are here talking about Mughal architecture and particularly taking mosque as a reference, and we'll try to understand what is the system of making involved and what are the different guiding principles which are embedded within that system. So something starting from orientation. When we talk about orientation, there is a reference taken to Kaaba, and when Kaaba is taken as a point of origin, accordingly the orientation of the mosque is done. So towards Kaaba, which is the west here. Then there is axis. So we see these two axes which are intersecting at the ablution, the sun over here. We see symmetry. So we see symmetry over here in the building. So this geometric principle formed a very important driving force for the entire conception of the religious institution, followed in almost all the religions. It is maintained in Islam from the whole to the part, stating the stability of the structure and thus the religion. So this is how the symmetry was seen as a guiding principle, and utilizing this system, it gave a stable form, and it also had to do with what the religion stated. So there was this close harmony between the built form as a method of construction and the belief system that was put forward in the religion. Going ahead, we see the principle of grid, which is defined in this system of construction, and here we see this grid over here, how the entire building is divided into a stable grid, and what we see in the plan, that is actually translated also in the elevation and the section. So that grid follows. Then the module. So there is this very interesting principle of squaring of the circle. So from here, this square to this point, this is a sort of an evolution of a module. So the relation between the formal spatial attributes could be seen here. From a square to a point, the transformation literally gives the form to the module. Underlying meaning of from the earthly matters to infinity. So this has been taken as the earthly matter, and this is the manifestation of being translated to infinity. Here again we see this close harmony between the manifestation belief system and the actual tangible form. Proportions, we have been talking about proportions. So here we see the root 2 system being the most predominant one, the root 2 system, and how we see here these proportions being achieved by the root 2 system, plan and elevation both. Then there is layering. So we see the different volumes being created, this over here and then this over here. The different volumes which are being created, they sort of do a layering which creates interest in the build form. And also the sequencing, which is an extension of layering, how the sequencing is done and how the various components help to design the layers. Now the next one that we will discuss is the disposition of components. So if we talk about a module, within a module the components, they were placed such as to create the verticality from the base to the top. So if we see over here, the way the components have been placed and they give this sense of verticality is again a guiding principle. Then we talk about point of origination. A single module has multiple points of originations, and this can create space through which we can orient ourselves. Then there is centrality. So a strong central axis, this can be observed, that connects the part to the whole. And talking about the form space relationship, the inner space of the built reflects the outer elevation or form. So that kind of relationship again is achieved through these guiding principles of making, and this system is there in place for us to understand and take it forward. Now talking about the volumetric composition, it depicts the space as the mass and the mass as the void, and assists us in understanding the complete composition of the space. So, the massing of the blocks and the intervening space between. How are they interrelated and how it gives us the sense of this entire spatial configuration. That is again a guiding principle of this volumetric composition. Some more examples. Here if we see this Koti Banal style of architecture in Uttarakhand, this is the entire elaborate discussion of the exploded view, which gives the different layers of how, starting from the plinth to this stone slab, the principles of making are applied and how this entire build form is then conceived and achieved. So, there is again this system in place. Also, where does the livestock go, and then where is the kitchen and the bedroom and the puja room, the attic for the storage, what happens on the ground floor and what happens on the first floor, what goes on the second floor, also in response to the climate and the resistance to the earthquake. So, this is an entire system and it needs to be understood before understanding the build form. This same thing here, this is the drawing from Himachal, and what we see in the Koti Banal architecture, similar example here we see the Kathkuni architecture. Here also there is this system in place, and the book Matra has very elaborately described all the classification, the house typologies and the principles of making different layers from the bottom to the top. Again, the ways of construction, the technical details also given with proper measurement. So, technical drawings are again a system to document, to analyze, to create a repository. Here also we see that analysis and the creation of repository. This is one house in Munsiari, Uttarakhand, and we see also a system of placing the craft, at what eye level it is to be placed. We also see a system of local terms. What is the local terminology and what is every element called in the local parlance. So, the vertical element, the lintel is called patav, and then there is chhajja, and the roof is called the pal. So, this system of local parlance and to understand the vocabulary which is used in a particular region is also an important tool to analyze and understand and decode the interior architecture and the craft practices. So, here we were talking about the placement of craft and what kind of motifs go at what level, which is the eye level where they are placed and what is the significance and meaning behind them. This itself is also a sort of a system which has come into place through empirical knowledge and now also technically proven and scientifically proven. Again, the technical drawings, we were talking about the technical drawings, how they again create a system of understanding and make a sort of a repository of observations and inferences, and we get to understand and decode the space within where the inhabitants stay. Some more technical drawings and the details. So, it helps us understand the activity also, in which particular zone, at what particular height, what kind of activity happens. So, again technical drawings are a very good tool to understand, and they give a sort of a system to decode the interior architecture. This is another technical drawing that we see over here, activity section, the mapping of different kinds of activities, where is the storage happening, where is the bedroom and all the other details. And I would like to end by discussing very briefly this workshop that was conducted at IIT Roorkee itself, and I was coordinating it. We had the experts, Mr. Varun Thottam from Mexico and Professor Shankar, who is a retired professor from my department, and he is still teaching in other universities. And we were making this Mexican dome out of mud mortar. There was no reinforcement used there. And this again is a system of documenting and archiving from step 1 to step end, last one. How do we really document and try to understand the process involved, to understand what the making actually follows stepwise. So, starting from understanding the soil, understanding the composition, mixing the right amount of water, creating the mud mortar over here, then the sieving and getting the fine mud mortar ready. Also, testing the bricks for testing the mud mortar for adhesion and load bearing capacity using the bricks, creating samples in different ratio to learn and understand which one is more stable, which one would expand and crack, which one would stay for long. And then starting from the first step after the mud mortar is ready, how we start from the first brick and how in steps we try to get this dome going. So this is one corner, and then from outside the curve is achieved, from inside the curve is achieved. So there is one curve like this and one like this, and there are three curves over here. This is from the inside, one corner, the another corner, this corner, and how the entire dome is taking shape. Again the four corners here. This one is the making, further closer towards the end. This is the last one to go, and this is how it looks from inside, and this is what it is there as a tangible prototype in the department. So this step-by-step procedure for documenting and archiving also gives us an insight to understand the process of making and decode what goes within the making of the dome. I would like to end with few interesting quotes. To provide meaningful architecture is not to parody history but to articulate it. We are talking about systems, and systems help us understand articulation. Our opportunity as designers is to learn how to handle the complexity rather than shy away from it, and to realize that the big art of design is to make complicated things simple. So if we understand these underlying principles of making and the systems which are embedded, it's very simple to understand the most complex things, and it's very simple to understand the fundamentals. So the next module we will continue our discussions on this and some references now which would be beneficial for all of us. We were talking about systems of making in Koti Banal architecture, and we see the references here. Himachal, we again see the Kathkuni architecture. Also the guidelines for stone construction in Uttarakhand. So these are also sort of systems in place. Some more references. We were talking about Vastu Shastra and Upanishads, so we have some references there. Thank you.